I'm going to be looking at a topic that I wrote with my co-excavators, Meek, about the two sites that we excavated, and we investigated them at a site I've been working at for a very long time. So you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. And the surprising thing that we found was the amount of plastic, which is what we'll go on to look at a little bit later on. But I thought I'd give you a bit of the context which the hymn contributes to, because that helps you understand the situation of the site where we found this material, which makes it both surprising and disappointing, but also gives you a bit of a context. We all know that archaeological knowledge is created in a social and cultural context, and that is really important at this site, where not only are we uncovering things about the past, but also interpreting them to visitors who are both tourists from across the UK and internationally, and also to local communities, particularly school children. So therefore, the social and cultural contexts are really important to understand the site and the work that goes on there, and how this particular set of deposits that we found have been created. So that's what I'm going to go through. We've got quite a few slides to get through, so some of them we'll go through pretty quickly, but to give you a bit of a flavour. And it's very topical to be talking about plastic. In the newspaper in the UK today, we had this study being published about takeaway food and drink litter dominating the ocean's plastic, and noting that the two per capita worst countries for plastic discard and entry into the oceans was the US and the UK. So but we're not going to be looking at what's in the ocean. We're looking at what is being deposited on the ground, but of course that can then end up in the ocean at some point, but also can be affecting the terrestrial ecology. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, because there's so many things being written, increasingly terrible things being written about the oceans, but we need to remember there's more to Earth than just the oceans. Now, the site where I've been excavating since 1981, yes, that's right, 1981, is where the red arrow is on the map of England and Wales and southern Scotland there that you see on the left. It's in a vertical aerial photograph at the bottom there. It's rather overgrown with vegetation at that point. And it was due to this person on the right, who was an accountant by profession, but was a bit of a showman, and he set up the site as a tourist attraction, having made a lot of money selling on another tourist attraction, which is now owned by Madam Tussauds. So that was the way in which it got set up, but it got set up in the context of a culture which is extremely Welsh. I am not a Welsh speaker. These two maps, the green one is 2001, the blue one is 2011, with slightly different scales, unfortunately. But the area that we're concerned with is in the sort of mid to dark blue area in North Pembrokeshire. And so it's a pretty Welsh cultural area. The whole of Wales is culturally Welsh in terms of rugby and various forms of non-conformist religion and so on. But some parts of Wales are much more active in terms of their language espousal. Now, what is interesting about this is that we're looking here at a language which is spoken almost exclusively bilingually now. There are hardly any people who only speak Welsh. But the darkest blue areas are 70% of the population have in the census, in the blue, said that they speak Welsh as their dominant language. and the mid-blue is between 50 and 70%. So we're looking at a lot of people. In some of the areas which are the mid-blue, the reason why they're mid-blue in both Southwest Wales and in North Wales is because of English immigration. In the case of Southwest Wales, because people retire to that area, and in North Wales, because people are moved, who need housing, are moved from the areas just into England into this area because housing is very cheap if they have to be given supported housing. So there are a number of reasons why some of these areas are paler. But the important thing to realise is also that if you look at the southeast of Wales, which is the most densely populated area, you will see that actually it's more blue than it was green. And that is because education now up to the age of 11 has compulsory Welsh language education for all children in Wales. Wales it's part of the Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so it has representation in the London Parliament, but it also has its own assembly. It's a bit like a state in the US. Okay, so it can do its own legislation in some aspects of life, and Welsh language and indeed all aspects of heritage are managed by the Welsh Assembly, not by London. This Welsh language map also can be compared with the red line in the map in the middle, which is of the southwest part of Wales. And that line is called the Landsca, and that line is a relic of 12th century settlement. The area south of the line was settled by people from the Low Countries, from Holland and from England, when the Normans conquered a large part of Wales, and that was the area they settled. The area to the north didn't have that settlement and so remained much more Welsh. And that line has remained as a phenomenon in the language divide from the Norman period right through until today, because you can see it matches where there's the shift to the much paler blue on the left-hand map and the almost no green at all on the right-hand map. So that's the context. So we're in a very Welsh-speaking area, and we're in a national park. And this national park on the left shows in purple the national parks, and the yellowish green colour is the areas of outstanding national beauty, which are a level down from a national park. Now, these areas are not like your national parks. They are not owned by the government. The land in them is largely privately owned, but it's another level of planning and landscape management, which is carried out by these national parks to ensure their beauty and with a heightened momentum for increasing and facilitating public access in those lands, whoever owns them. So that is the purpose of the national parks in the UK. They're not the same as yours. And the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park is in area one of the smallest in the country, and it consists of these areas around here, which you see larger in the bottom right-hand map. And Castell Henllys, where we're going to be looking, is within this national park and is now owned and managed by them. It was originally taken over from the owner when he died from his family, by the local county council, and they have now placed it with the national park to manage it. So this is the site. We've extensively excavated inside the fort. Has big earthworks around it, and there's an area outside which was used in prehistory and then also in the Roman period with native farmstead on it. And it's this site that we've excavated since 1981, and from a very early stage we began rebuilding. The first owner wanted to have reconstructions to attract the public, and so this house here was the first, then this one, and so on. And gradually these buildings have been constructed. The whole of the interior would have been full of houses in the period from about 400 BC to about 100 BC, when the site was abandoned and people moved out to the farmstead just outside in an area that had previously just been for animals. And we excavated these houses. We do area excavation in the UK as our normal method of examining this type of settlement, and rather than with test pitting and so on. And we find the wall gullies of the roundhouses. Sometimes there's an eave strip gully to carry the runoff of the rainwater, and there's arrangements of post holes inside to support the roof. And this house was rebuilt a number of times. Some of the bits of wall line there's more than one line there. And we've used this evidence to then decide how we're going to do the reconstructions. We identify which post holes will mark up the circle. The pale ones are ones stirred by animal burrowing, and so we're not identifiable. The red ones are the doorposts. We then put the wall line on. We then work out where the eaves of the roof go, and then we create a conical building that matches those particular on the ground features. And so the top left picture, this is all the same roundhouse at different rethatchings over the years. So this house went up in 1982. So this house has therefore stood for a long time. We then built another roundhouse down here, a little one, and then the third roundhouse was the one with the red arrow there. And the top left shows the building with overlapping other roundhouse foundations that were older. And this one is the one that we reconstructed. You can see on the right there, the third, the red dot is this roundhouse being reconstructed after the other two were done. And there's the owner enthusiastically involved in the rebuilding. This was actually done using Earthwatch volunteers. I don't know whether any of you have ever used Earthwatch volunteers. We used them on this reconstruction and also on some graveyard surveys. When I started doing my graveyard surveys in Pembrokeshire, they were very active and helpful in doing those. And so this house is called the Earthwatch House for that very reason. The first house has had a variety of names, but the National Park call it the Cook House. Look, that's the house. And the left of the picture at the bottom, the one on the right, is the second roundhouse we reconstructed, which is a much smaller one. These two are each sort of 10 to 11 meters in diameter. And you can see the construction of these houses. They're timber, wattling, daub, clay, manure, straw mixture put on, and then a reed thatch roof. And so this is the Earthwatch Roundhouse, and it's the Earthwatch Roundhouse that the National Park have used for their schools, presentations and storytelling, and where the children go and eat their packed lunches if, as it quite often does in Wales, particularly in the winter, it's raining. So this house gets a particular sort of use which isn't quite the same as the other roundhouse. So we can see on this notice in the car park of the site, you are here, here's the car park, that you go to the visitor centre here, which we'll see another picture in a minute, and then you work your way up onto the fort, which is up a hill, and it's on a promontory sticking out into the valley, and you can visit the roundhouses as well as various other features we won't have time to talk about today. But the site, as you can see here, it's all bilingual. Some of you may be working in areas where you do a lot of signs in English and Spanish. You will know that bilingual signs limit quite severely the amount of text you can put on, and can therefore be a challenge about how you display that. But you can see the importance of having to do this in this context. So I've done a red line on this aerial photograph just to show how you go from the interpretation centre here, and where you pay to come in. You can go to the cafe on your way out. and you walk over the stream, which you can't really see hidden in all this vegetation. You walk by the stream along here, and then you gradually climb up the hill, and then you enter into the outer annex area. You cross that, you go through where the major gateway into the fort was. You go around looking at the houses, and indeed a four-post granary there, granary raised off the floor, and then you leave down a different route that brings you back onto this path that takes you back down to the shop. So this is the normal pattern of movement of people around the site, and it's the pattern also that the school parties do, and they do various activities and get inducted into various aspects of Iron Age Celtic life as they go along this sort of route. So here's the interpretation centre at the bottom. It's got a grass topped roof, and it used to have this spiral by which the children would go back through time. They'd run around this spiral, and when they came out of it, they were back in the Iron Age. They've got rid of the spiral now. You do the same by crossing over a different bridge into the stream, across the stream and into the Iron Age. So they're in the Iron Age all the time there at the fort. Even though they do things like wash their hands before they eat their lunches and things like that for the inevitable health and safety reasons. So, but the idea is that they try and have an immersive experience. The visitors, the rest of the public, don't do that. They are in the present, engaging with a representation of the past, which again provides its own challenges in that there are two sorts of ways of viewing the site, and some of you may be interested in that as an issue in terms of how you do interpretation and what's the role of a costumed interpreter and so on. Okay, so these costumed interpreters here with the schools are supposedly in the Iron Age. Okay, and they do about 40 to 50% of their teaching through the medium of Welsh. The schools choose whether they want to be taught in Welsh or English. And a very large number of them want to be done in Welsh. So the interpreters have to be bilingual. And they are mainly very local people, and they're not skilled in archaeology or anything like that. They are skilled in interpreting at this site through training, but they're not otherwise necessarily graduates in archaeology or in anything like that. They do various activities and learn either by watching or by doing various crafts. They're doing a bit of wattling there and so on, and they generally have a wonderful time. This is the other house interior, the cook house, which is more emphasizing everyday life, whereas the other roundhouse is more like a meeting room house where they have their storytelling and so on. So the houses have different functions. The little roundhouse is a blacksmith's workshop as a display, but it's much smaller, so it's difficult to get a school party. You can't get many school children in there at once. So we excavated these houses because they were taken down in successive years because the National Park felt they were unsafe. I didn't think they were unsafe, but they were worried about squashed school children, so they wanted them taken down and then rebuilt on the same sites again after the best part of nearly, well, one case 30 years, in another case nearly 30 years. And we persuaded them that it would be a very good idea if they supported us doing a funded excavations of each site to understand what had been going on with this building below ground, to match with their records of above ground, and to see what we found and make recommendations about how they should do the reconstructions next time to counteract any problems that had been encountered through our reconstruction decisions this time. And that, in those regards, we were completely successful. So this is the cookhouse excavation, and at the same time there were the costumed interpreters interpreting for sometimes schools, more often by that time of the year, the public coming around and seeing the site, and so we're able to see our excavations as well. And that's what the reconstructed first roundhouse looked like after it was redone. A number of problems with it, which I could discuss with you at another time, but the point is that's now in its second completely new manifestation, after having various bits of partial rebuild in the previous 30 years. And this is the second one, the doorway there. This is bits of seating around the central half. This is the bottom curved part is a bit of the walling that still was upstanding when we started excavating. But you can see all the dark deposits that have formed inside the roundhouse during the time it's been in use. And you can see there, looking into the roundhouse, you can also see some of this straw and so on is from the thatch all being taken off, but some of it is also material that built up during the life of the roundhouse. And that's what the roundhouse looks like when it's completely dismantled, and it is frighteningly similar to what an archaeological excavation of an Iron Age roundhouse looks like. So for many aspects of this experiment, we were justified in the decisions that we had made. But you can see where the ranging rods are, and inside the curve of the wall, the flooring, which the park have been putting down successively to try and deal with wear inside the houses, is still there. It's not outside. There's the eaves drip gully. So this area here was between the wall and where the eaves come down close to the ground. So that area isn't floored in the same way and has had a different depositional history. So we excavated some of these floorings and discovered how parts of the site have been built up and other parts have been rather worn away by wear. It's built up because the slope of the ground slopes slightly, and the various phases of the roundhouse, they tried to make more of the floor level and kept dumping material down, and also was sweeping bits of refuse into the corner. So we have a series of phases. Here we see at the bottom right, you can see the amount of build-up that occurred on this side of the roundhouse. And there were lots of phases of the roundhouse that we could identify, including the use of props to hold up the roof. It's one of the reasons the park didn't like it. They felt it was unsafe, but in fact, it wasn't unsafe at all. But you know, they had that view. One of the reasons they had that view is that they asked a structural engineer whether this building was safe, could it stand up? And the structural engineer put the measurements into his computer program and said it was impossible for the building to stand up, despite the fact that it had been standing for 30 years, including against hurricane winds. But his model couldn't cope with the form of construction of this house because it wasn't designed for non-modern building regulation type methods of fixing things together. So it said the building would fall down. So that got them really worried, and they felt that they wouldn't be able to insure themselves. So that's why it came down. We managed, though, on the rebuild to not have too many changes because they realized on reflection that was a bit daft. Here you see the build-up of deposits again, that's where the wall foundation was for the house. So we were collecting finds as we had them coming up in the excavation. We were 3D plotting them, but it got to the point where in some parts of the site, it was just vast amounts of material. And so we had to do it by 30 centimeter sort of zones in order to bag up the material. Otherwise, we'd have been still there now. So we wouldn't have really told us any more than we were getting from that level of detail. So we excavated the cookhouse, the first roundhouse, and then the Earthwatch roundhouse, and these were the sorts of finds that we were getting. Oh, sorry. And I've removed from this the finds that are to do with the Iron Age replica activities, of which there were a few. And they're quite interesting in themselves. But there were activities, artifacts concerned with activities for the school children, and many artifacts produced and deposited by the children. So the cookhouse distribution, was perhaps more or less what we had expected. We had thatching tags, which are plastic tags, which were on the bundles of reed that were used for the top part of the roof. The local hippies had cut reeds for most of the thatching. They were meant to do it for all, but their time management skills were not quite up to that. And they had to stop because the birds were nesting in the reeds in the nature reserve. And so the top thatch had to be imported from Hungary. And it came with little plastic tags. And we found 5 of those tags, and none for the Earthwatch house because that had just UK reeds for its roof. We also found face paint containers deposited inside the house because a lot of the face painting for the children happens either just inside or just outside this house. And we had a range of other items which were not surprising given the range of activities that were there, including some items to do with tourism, like part of a camera eyepiece and so on. So the finds from that roundhouse were perhaps not too surprising. What was surprising was the Earthwatch roundhouse, where we had a large amount of other material. We had a lot of nails because they burnt a lot of wood on the fire in there to make it warm for the school parties. And they used a lot of wood that came from local farmers, which still had nails in it. So that's how that sort of developed as a huge assemblage within the fire, but the fireplace area. But other than that, the big difference was the way in which we had these large numbers of pieces of plastic or plasticized paper that were recovered from this roundhouse. People would sit, the tourists would sit in the cookhouse around the fire and soak up the atmosphere, but they didn't tend to do things there that led to the deposition of large amounts of refuse. And this site, as you can see from all these pictures, is kept very tidy. For the school parties and for the general public, the idea is that people are experiencing aspects of what it was like in the Iron Age. And having lots of litter blowing around is not what it was like in the Iron Age. So the staff are very observant of any litter which they pick up as they wander around. The public don't have much chance to acquire litter. There's not, the shop doesn't sell sweets and so on with wrappings. And the children are busy doing activities most of the time. So the amount of litter being deposited, there is some, but it's not a lot, and the staff are very eagle-eyed about removing it because it destroys the visual images that is so important for the public to experience. So we're not looking here at a site where people are not bothered about these aspects of the environment, quite the reverse. In that sense, it's a bit different from some of the other studies where people have looked at modern material culture, such as with homeless groups and so on, where often these types of items have been deliberately curated and collected. This is not the situation here. So you can see enormous amounts of straw wrappers and straw wrapper fragments and sweet wrapper fragments. And I expect your apples are the same as ours. They often have a little sticker on them telling you the variety of apple, and we had quite a number of those. So we have a few Iron Agey type things. We have a loom weight, clay loom weight, top right, a bit of string, Iron Age style string, and we have this Iron Age style, supposedly, knife, which has been, actually that iron was forged on the site and put into this wooden handle and bound with bits of rather modern looking twine, but done during an experimental residency, which I could talk more about if anyone was interested. But what we really had lots of were bits of wrappings, and a lot of them were these little bits that you tear off when you're trying to get into your chocolate bar or your packet of sweets, and those are the bits that have got discarded. The big whole packets, in most cases, were not lost, or if they were lost, they were recovered by the staff, either by the teachers with the children or by the park staff So this is the smaller bits. And we're not having the sort of stuff that was to do with that article I showed at the beginning, which was all about takeaway food. No take, that's the big disaster for the oceans. This isn't a takeaway food location. This is a picnic snack food location, which is why we have lots of these bits of straw wrappings and straws and cartons like this. I don't know whether you have those in the States. These are very common for parents to put in their school children's pack-ups. We didn't have a single carton. These are plastic lined cartons. We didn't have a single one of those because those, again, are the sorts of things you collect and take away with you. But the bits of wrapping to get the straw out, or you then drop the straw in the dark of the roundhouse and you don't see where it's gone, you don't fancy picking it up and putting it back in your drink, those are the bits that have got discarded. So here are the face paint tins and the face painting going on in the cookhouse. So we have the replica of that activity. These have not been deliberately deposited, they've been lost by the staff and then buried under sweepings, particularly under the bed which was slightly raised off the ground. They did a lot of sweeping the floor to keep it tidy, and they swept dirt and gravel under the bed and buried these things so they couldn't carry on using them or recover them. So the cookhouse, as you see, has a number of different things, but it has a quarter of the deposit is sweet wrappers, but an awful lot of it is other sorts of things. And there's a lot of different, and that shows one of the thatching tags there with Hungarian on it, just to show where it came from. And the Earthwatch house has this enormous amount of sweet wrappers and various other types of item. There are no thatching tags on that one, it's the same scale. So what else did we have apart from sweet wrappers? We had lots of these little spoons or spatulas for eating little pots of material, yogurts or mousses or whatever. The pots, again, have been cleared away, but these spoons are small enough. We had a few things that I'm sure they weren't deliberately left behind, like a pair of children's spectacles, a complete carving knife. But we had lots of wrinkles, including the ones that are meant to stay attached to the can, which had clearly been pulled off by the children whilst they were sitting, waiting for the rain to stop or whatever, or not very excited by the storytelling inside the roundhouse. So we had large numbers of those. So I've rushed through that quickly because I thought it's more important to have a discussion and go back to things that people find interesting. And I can bring up the sharing again if there's anything people want to go back to. But what we learn from this is that our incidental use of a range of products produces this terrestrial background noise, which is insidious. And it's much more worrying than one might imagine. And it's different from the major dumping, the sort of old-fashioned refugee type project with the garbage project in Tucson and so on, where we're seeing vast amounts being dumped in tips. That will no doubt reduce because of recycling and so on. We've got strategies in a sense that can relate to that. This is actually a background pattern. We're hearing today about these takeaway plastics with fast food. You could imagine that McDonald's could decide to not use plastic at all and change all that quite easily. It's these other less prominent things like bits of crisp, or you call them chip packets, of sweet wrappers, candies you call them, don't you? All those types of things, those are the ones that are entering the terrestrial record in enormous numbers. And we need to think really about what we might be able to do about that. and whether, you know, the way in which that the chocolate bars are designed so that when you rip them open, it doesn't come right off that bit, it stays attached to the large part, which people then diligently put in the bin after keeping in their pocket till they see a bin. But the bit that they've just ripped off, it falls to the ground, or it blows away, or whatever. And that cumulatively is an enormous amount. There's also a lot of cling film wrapping around sandwiches and things like that. That was another big product. And so it was really interesting that if schools, which are really interested in avoiding plastic use, and the children who are terribly motivated to prevent damage to the planet, if only they knew what their pack-ups were doing for the environment, then that would be a useful lesson in itself. And indeed, I'm having a meeting, a Zoom meeting, and then I hope to be able to go down to the site next month about how we're going to bring some of this discovery into school teaching and the actual visitor display. It is already mentioned and illustrated in the guidebook, which is just being printed for this particular year. The first time they've had a proper guidebook. And so the plastic discoveries are now actually featuring in the guidebook to try and get through to the public that this is a major effect of our lifestyles in a way that we are not immediately thinking about. So I think I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions, comments. We can have a discussion, because that's really what's fun about this group.